Okay, I think are you guys ready? Yeah, I'm gonna start. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. I hope everybody had a chance to get food and to have some good conversation coming out of this morning's really thought-provoking plenaries and some breakout sessions too. I think in the interest of time, I still see people coming in, but we're going to go ahead and get started with this afternoon's plenary panel called Envisioning Critical Restoration Ecologies. My name is Manon Lefebvre, and I am a PhD student here, and I had the honor and privilege of inviting these scholars to speak with you this afternoon. We would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. So I'd like to begin this session by acknowledging the relationships of Indigenous peoples and nations to the land on which this event is taking place. We recognize that Indigenous peoples and nations, including Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Shtatuck, Golden Hill, Paugussett, Niantic, Quinnipiac, and other Algonquin-speaking peoples have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what is now called the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these peoples and nations and this land, which, as we know, was forcibly taken from them. I also just want to make a brief statement on the meaning of land acknowledgements, like the one I just read, which is a modified version of the statement that was released by Yale University last year. Although it's always important to center the relationship that Indigenous peoples and nations have to their ancestral lands, which is the purpose of land acknowledgement, and for us to acknowledge that we are today on stolen land, if you didn't know that already. I just want to remind us that doing so does not excuse or erase the ways in which institutions like Yale were and are part and parcel to colonization, genocide, and violent displacement of Native peoples here and across the world. It's critical that we understand history, but we must also challenge the structures of power that remain in place in our institutions, like these hallowed halls, and likewise in many corners of environmental conservation and restoration. So now I just want to briefly introduce the panel. So this panel, which I first kind of envisioned last fall, grows out of a concern that for too long, mainstream environmental discourses and material practices of conservation and restoration have failed to consider the voices and knowledge of those who do not fit within its institutions in matters of authority and decision-making. As feminist scholars contend, like the ones you see before you on the stage, ensuring planetary survival will require that we find new ways to call in diverse perspectives and knowledges, amplifying seldom heard voices to come up with new solutions. This will mean questioning our own assumptions, institutions, and even our own science to open possibilities into what radical change looks like and what it can do. This panel brings together three critical social scientists who interrogate the oft-hidden relationships of power embedded within discourses and practices of ecological restoration to imagine different ways of being. These incredible and incisive scholars privilege feminist and Indigenous perspectives to rethink the complex and fraught politics of restoration. Through their work, we find the space to ask ourselves just what we envision when we think of restoration, for what and for whom. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Dr. Rebecca Lave, who is an associate professor of geography at Indiana University. As a critical physical geographer, her work combines theories and methodologies of political economy, science and technology studies, and feminist political ecology, and fluvial geomorphology. It's not every scholar who can speak in one breath on the science of stream restoration and the social production of environmental knowledge. Dr. Lave's ability to bridge the physical and natural sciences with critical social theory and an attention to power and politics is remarkable, and what brings her here today. Her work focuses on questions that surround the construction of scientific expertise, market-based environmental management, and the ecology of stream restoration. She's published in journals from science to social studies of science. She's the author of Fields and Streams, Stream Restoration, Neoliberalism, and the Future of Environmental Science, and she's also the lead editor of the Handbook of Critical Physical Geography. Please welcome her to the stage.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. And I also wanted to say many thanks first. So first to Manon and Samara for getting us organized, to the student organizers of this conference. You all have done such an impressive job. And I hope you are extremely proud of yourselves. And I hope that if your professors are in the room, they are acknowledging the labor that you have put in to do this. I'm going to step away from the microphone for a moment and see if I am loud enough without the lavalier mic, and we'll see.
So can y'all hear me? Nope. Yes. Okay. If at any point you feel like you're not sure, like what you can't hear me, just like wave your hand and I'll turn the mic on. But for the moment, I'll just do loud professor voice. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to grab the clicker. Woo! All right. So here we go. Ordinarily, when I am speaking with audiences, I am talking about interdisciplinary, physical, and social science work. But I think, given that so many of you are already thinking about that today, I'm going to focus on something different today, which is about the ways in which not just restoration ecology practice, but also the science behind what we do is social. So that's where I'm going today. So just very quickly, there are a bunch of ways in which I've already heard restoration being acknowledged as a social practice today. So one thing is the goals. How do we determine what we're trying to achieve? Another thing, the scale of intervention and where we intervene, okay, is not typically set by where we think we might get the most ecological benefit. It's often guided by property relations. Okay, what can we acquire? What can we get access to? And costs. Where can we get funding from? Another way in which restoration is clearly social, which I've heard from you all, is concern for the people that are living in the area that may use it. Right? This is something that if you go back and look at early restoration projects was really not on people's radar very much, and very much was like, oh yes, you know what to do, we'll go do it. But people were very quickly disabused of that notion. And I will just say, I don't have examples from forestry because this is not my subject, but one of my favorite, quick and easy examples of this from stream restoration is a project along the San Joaquin River where they were doing riparian revegetation and they couldn't figure out why their willows kept disappearing. Turned out they made really excellent sticks for roasting marshmallows. Okay, but what I want to focus on in more detail is ways in which the socialness of what we do may be less apparent to you. And some of these may be things that you all feel like, yes, no, this good. But for others of you, I won't cover all of these things because I think some of them will be obvious, some of you, some of them won't. But I think it's worth talking them through. So what I'm going to talk through, and this is a bit of an outline of my talk, is who is entitled to speak with authority, how we understand the world around us, how we find our work, and the concepts that we use. Okay? And what I'm going to argue is that our findings themselves, the science on which we base our work, is social. Okay? And we have to think about their impacts in a different way because of that. So first of all, who speaks with authority? This is something that I expect many of you in this room have already encountered. Where I teach at Indiana University, we talk about bombs as the people that have the credibility. Big, old, white male. And every degree in which you diverge from that model are degrees in which you are fighting for your credibility to speak. Okay, other sources that come in here. Formal expertise. I've heard many of you talking today about how the people in the areas where you're working know so much about it. Okay, you walk in with your degree from here, from other programs, and you feel like, yeah, I know ecology, I know agroecology, I know forestry. But the people who are surviving based on that land know enormous about that, they don't have the qualifications. Okay, so you're more entitled to speak than they are, but who has the knowledge? Another thing to think about is even among academics, we distinguish who has the right to speak. Okay, so, for example, we talk about people based on their research productivity, how many grants they get. We have lots of metrics, H metrics, things like that. We don't think often about all the ways in which other sorts of burdens come in and limit what people can do. Let's take publication as an example. So, when I was in graduate school, there was a totally amazing professor in my department named Ruth Wilson-Gilmore, who did not meet the productivity standard for my department. Huge reason for that was that she was on something like 50 PhD studies. And it was an institution that wanted African American women to serve on committees. She was on many, many more committees than anybody else in the department, not just the research committees, but also service committees. Right? No one took account of that. And so using publications or funding levels as metrics builds in metrics. It builds in inequality in ways that you might not want it to. Other things to think about are the credibility of where we come from, right? What is the credibility of the institution we came from? What's our intellectual lineage, right? Some of us came from very, very prestigious advising groups, others didn't. But that's not a measure of who should be able to speak with authority. All right, other things to think about. This may be getting onto less familiar ground. It's really, really important to think about the way that we understand the world around us. Okay, so I haven't had people talk, I would know, say that in my science classes, which were in hydrology and geomorphology, I was taught that our science is objective, it is value neutral, that is what we're striving for. But nobody ever said and talked to me about the fact that the way we understand the world is also socially shaped, it's culturally specific. So it's things like the classifications and typologies that we use. When I look at a stream, how am I looking at it? What are the characteristics of it? What am I talking about? Forestry, and I'm out of my depth here, so I would be saying something very silly, but are you looking at, I think about old debates between succession and chaos, right? So when you're looking at a forest, are you describing it as something that has reached a climax state, or are you describing it as something that is in the process of recovering from the last disturbance? Okay, those kinds of framings matter. Other things that matter are the categories we use. What is it we measure? Are we measuring nitrogen? Are we measuring biomass? Are we measuring biodiversity? Or are we measuring utilities of human survival? Are we measuring ecosystem services? Different things we can measure, and they matter in terms of what our findings are. Another thing I want to point to is the way that we are often trained, and we're often trained to view things that have been shaped by humans as not natural. And I think what I've been hearing here today, I've been hearing a lot about knowledge, ecosystems, and acceptance of that, so maybe that's not a point that you all need to hear. But I think it's worth sitting with the ways in which we divide the natural from the human. So thinking about that. All right. How our work is funded. The political economy of restoration. So that's what I've been working on for the last 20 years. It's something I think about a whole lot. Obviously, I have a short period of time to speak, so I don't want to get into that in great detail, but I want to pull up a few things to think about. So first of all, our research is limited in many ways by what research can be funded. What is considered relevant, what donors want to hear from going to private sources, okay, or what our peers consider relevant. Another thing to think about is the ways in which our work is involved in a current wave of privatization of knowledge. So you can think about that in terms of bioprospecting and biopiracy, but it's also related to our work as academics, the way in which our work is getting commodified with increasing pressure to develop tools that can be patented, things along those lines. This is a moment in which the political economy of knowledge production is really coming into play. The last thing I want to talk about on this is the way in which the push towards commodification and market-based solutions distorts our findings and also our practices in the world. So I cannot speak to this in relation to forestry, but I know because of Brad that you have to deal with many of these same things. But in relation to streams, we have a market for ecosystem services in the United States that's called stream mitigation banking, okay? Which is a form of biodiversity offsetting, if you're familiar with that term, where we allow damage to one ecosystem as long as the person who does the damage pays to have another one restored. What we're talking about here then is how do you make ecosystems legible to markets? And in order to do that, you have to be able to create it as a stable, standardized commodity. And what that means is it can't change, it can't be connected to other things, it has to be severable. That doesn't sound like any ecosystem I've ever heard. Yeah. I'm guessing forests, this is true of in the same way it's true of streams. So there's an enormous inherent tension between moves toward market funding, and we talked this morning about the funding we need to do the kind of work we want to do. How are we going to scale up? We need funding. But think about what that funding means and how we make our work legible to markets is really important. All right. The concept, another way in which the science of what we do is intrinsically social. So some of the key, so this is doing, well, all right, whatever. Slide is not exactly what, this is how text that I wanted, so be all right. So think about the ways in which concepts that we use in our work all the time without thinking about it carry historical baggage with them. Okay, so I was taught in my, so things that you were taught in your classes are things that you were told were true, but no one ever goes back to the store side of them for you. And a great example of this comes from the idea of carrying capacity. Neutral measure. How many people can you support on the earth? How much livestock can you support on the earth? Right? These are presented as objective measurements. But it's really important to think about where they come from. So first thing to realize is the idea of carrying capacity has its roots in eugenicist, colonial repression of pastoralist peoples. Okay, so trying to argue why those people should have lower stocking rates and finding language that comes from science to justify a political goal. Because guess what about carrying capacity, people? It depends on how you manage the lake. You cannot say objectively any piece of land will hold this many cattle or this many people. It depends how you live. So when we use the term carrying capacity, we are using the word language to be justified political ends. And many of our other concepts have that same kind of baggage that we don't really think about. But if we use them, what's that saying about our work? How are we being implicated in those relationships? So all of this pulls in. The slides, is there a way to do this?
Yeah, advertising that we opened the wrong line.
Okay. I'm sorry to have this moment to stop, but the slides have more text on them than is coming up. And I'm feeling discomfited by this.
Yes, hold on. Gosh, it's not here. Just gives you a minute to really think about what she's saying.
Imagine how it applies to your field sites, into your life. So I'm actually, when we get the right one, I'm going to go back a few slides and just have a
Here, do you want to come over here? And
Let's cut off at the bottom. Let's cut off the bottom.
here, if you want to I'll just start it from the slide that you want.
Start from the who has authority to speak slide.
Is that the slide that you
No, it's way up at the top.
Oh.
I will not spend much time on each of these slides, but I just want to just quickly point to this thing of. There we go. Yay! Okay, so all of these things that I talked about earlier shape who is listened to and who is not. Okay, this speaks to who is allowed to speak. All of these ways about which we understand the world, okay, shape what we see when we look and what we don't see when we look. And all of this matters, okay, we're arguing because it affects the questions we ask and the questions we ignore, both of which are important. And it does affect our actual findings. Right? It's very common, I think, to accept that there are social influences on the practice of science, but the ideal that I was raised with certainly is that the scientific method will cushion us from those things. It will allow us to insulate ourselves from them. And what I'm trying to say here is that it actually doesn't. Okay? Because of all of these basic things about how we ask questions, what we see, what we don't ask, how we answer them, shapes the content of our science. The content of our science, in turn, shapes how we manage the environment. Okay? Every practitioner in the room is we are all trying to do our best based on what we know from our classes, right? And what we learn. It affects how we manage the environment. And how we manage the environment has really profound ecosocial impacts. Okay? And here I think I'm singing the choir a little bit, but I want to point out that restoration projects, this beautiful goal, restoration is what gets me up in the morning with an idea, right? It's a way of fending off despair. It is such a beautiful thing to think about. And yet, it's really important to acknowledge that it has had all these terrible kinds of impacts, like loss of access to key resources with land seizures, legitimization of state control or privatization. Okay. And it makes us complicit in many ways in ecological degradation, in two ways that I want to talk about. One is that in focusing on fixing things, we may be less focused on trying to prevent them from happening in the first place, and from calling out the often very exploitive capitalistic processes that got us here in the first place. And then the second thing is that when we restore, we aren't putting things back the way we found them in some kind of kindergarten sort of way. Restored ecosystems are not the same as what came before. I'm not talking about novel versus native. That's not the distinction I'm trying to make here. When we study stream restoration projects, what we find is that they are not creating ecological lift. Okay? They do not have better water quality. Don't have better water temperature. In fact, usually the water temperature is worse because many of the techniques used to restore streams involve having to remove all riparian vegetation. We don't have higher rates of macro-benthic invertebrates, that is bugs. We don't have higher rates of fish. We are not making a positive difference. So I would argue that restoration, our participation in restoration, is making us complicit in these things, and that we need to really think about them. So, what shall we do? Because that matters, right? I'm not going to give up. I hope you won't either. So, first thing to me is to approach our work with humility, and the understanding that what our science tells us cannot be the end of the conversation. Second thing, we need to explore different ways of knowing and understanding the world around us. And I think one of the key ways to do that is start thinking about relations between human and extra-human nature in very different ways. And the third thing is to acknowledge these ecosocial impacts of our work, which I've been hearing here, which has been so great to hear, and work with the communities that are affected to try to change them. Right? So it's not me saying, okay, these are the things that what we're doing in the world, these are the other kind of consequences, these are things we didn't mean, and now we're putting the one block on that. So that's where I'm going with this. I will leave you with just a few ideas. If this intrigues you, if you want to think a little bit more about the ways in which science is social, here are two easy resources. They're both very accessible reads. I will happily, they're book trackers, which means they are less convenient to get to. So anybody that emails me, I will very happily send them to you. Thank you very much.
Is that you? Okay. You do have, okay. Okay, our next speaker is Dr. Juanita Sundberg. She's an associate professor of geography at the University of British Columbia. Her work speaks across and through many disciplines: environmental justice, feminist political ecology, critical race theory, posthumanism, Latin American studies, science and technology studies, and I could go on. Dr. Sundberg's work challenges conventional notions of what it means to study and understand landscapes. Her work interrogates the long-standing and insidious relationship between imperialism and the management of our environment. Connecting ecologies, colonial histories, the production of knowledge, and the material environment, Dr. Sundberg explores the ways in which colonial relations of power continue to shape not just our social worlds, but our physical landscapes. Importantly, she invites us to question what it means to be human in the Anthropocene and calls on us to make space for the other than human in the ways we listen to and understand the world around us. So please welcome her.
Thank you very much for that. I'm really honored to be here with all of you today, and I don't know why this is happening. No phone. Anyway, what you're going to witness is, as we try to figure this out, is the sort of difference in our discipline of geography between physical geographers and human geographers, and maybe even between human geographers, because physical geographers tend to just talk out their talks and refer to slides, and human geographers tend to read things. So I will try to refer to. That's not better. Okay, maybe I'll just stand over here then. But just stand here and use this one?
That works.
Okay.
Or this one you can turn off. Where's people?
Before sorry to you guys. He told me to move her away from the thing. But this turns off everything though.
No, just this one.
Mm-mm.
I can just use this, that's
Oh,
fine.
no.
If you can use this, that would be.
Yeah, I'll just use this, it's easier.
Is that control?
Okay, Are we on? Am I on? Okay, awesome. All right, I was trying to say that I'm really honored to be here with you all, and I also have many thanks to give to folks who made this happen. I also want to express my gratitude to the original caretakers of this land, and I hope that we honor their relationships with the other than human world today in the work that we do. And that we are able to support their struggles for self-determination through the work that we do. I want to start by saying I'm not a practitioner of restoration, and I have tremendous respect for the work that y'all do in terms of working towards some of those goals. My perspectives on tropical forests are rooted in my experience growing up in tropical forests as the child of missionaries in Central America. These experiences shaped the way I understand the world in fundamental ways. When I got to grad school, I didn't understand the literature that we were reading. I didn't understand why it presumed this kind of bifurcation between humans and other than humans, earth beings. I didn't understand this framing of natural resources. For whatever reason, the experiences of walking through forest with the indigenous communities where we lived taught me to see the world in different ways that are not bifurcated. I can't really explain why this is, but I sort of came away from that experience thinking about the world in terms of all beings as persons, soulful. I don't know why, but I'm not trying to say that I'm going to project indigenous people's ways of being, not at all. But I got something that I carry with me that shapes everything that I do. I also did my dissertation research in the Maya Biosphere Reserve in northern Guatemala, and I saw playing out there the kinds of bifurcations that I had seen in graduate school as U.S. NGOs tried to remake tropical forests with this imaginary of pristine nature. This is all to say that I offer my comments today in the spirit of sharing, in the hopes of inviting reflection and conversation. I wanted to start by looking at the title. Oops, there we go. Not where I lived, but just some beautiful forests. All right, I just wanted to start by looking at the title of the conference. So, Restoration for What and Whom? Shifting the Paradigm. And I'm curious about the first part of this title. So the phrasing seems to suggest that there's a distance between those who do restoration and those who are subject to restoration. The whom seems to indicate people, because in the English language, at least, that and which are grammatically correct to refer to animals and other creatures. Of course, there's flexibility these days, apparently, and you are allowed to call your pets who. Second part of the title, right? Whose paradigms need to shift? Whose models? And what does management really mean anyway? I looked it up on Google. This is what comes up, right? It's talking about control. It's talking about resources. It's talking about goals. So whose goals, right? And for what purposes? My point here is not to criticize anyone for the words, but to get at the ontological dimensions of the words that we as practitioners, as scholars, commonly use every day. These words are positing an ontological division between us and them, whether we're talking about us as scholars and them as local people, or humans and non-humans. And these divisions are characteristic of Western ways of knowing. Let's see here, where am I? Nope. All right. These are characteristic of ways of knowing, Western ways of knowing, sorry. And they're by no means universal. I think that's really important for us to get in our head. The way that we are trained to conceive of the world in westernized disciplines teaches us to assume this distance, this difference, this hierarchy, in fact. So to actually address some of the questions that are posed as goals for this conference, we may need to do a lot more than shift paradigms. We may need to address the ontological politics that are at play if we hope to achieve goals like, quote, developing projects led by and inclusive of those most affected by forest loss. That's one of the goals for this thing. Quote, proposals that combat colonial legacies. And one of the most significant legacies of colonialism is the imposition of Eurocentric, Euro-American ways of thinking, knowing, and worlding. And perhaps legacy is really the wrong word here because it fails to convey the fact that European colonialism or coloniality is not a thing of the past. It is ongoing even as it takes different forms in different places. And Dr. Chamba referred to this when she made reference to the state forestry agencies in different African countries, that they continue, right, to put forward this colonial legacy. So what do we mean by ontological politics? The anthropologist Mario Blaser and his colleague Marisol de la Cadena define political ontology as a vision of politics that seeks to, quote, here it is, enable political thought and practice beyond the onto-episteme of modern politics and what its practice allows, right? So they're thinking about the limitations of this kind of Eurocentric episteme that so fundamentally shapes all science and social science today. Political ontology rejects the notion of the world as a universe, a one world world. The one world world, sorry, it's a very awkward expression. The one world world of modernity operates on the presumption that different cultural groups have different perspectives on the world, different cultures have different perspectives, but ultimately we're talking about one single reality that is out there that we can study, measure, observe, etc. More specifically, the one world world is meant to refer to the notion of one reality that can be comprehended and explained through modern Western sciences, social or natural. In this way, the one world world, and here I'm citing from Blaser, has granted itself the right to assimilate all other worlds. By presenting itself as exclusive, it cancels the possibilities for what lies beyond its limits. So enacting the world as a universe, right, implies drawing lines around what ways of organizing the world count. What ways of bringing the world into being should be permitted to live, and what ways should be let to die or even destroyed. Whoops, there we go. All right. So what is meant by ontology here? That's important for us to establish as we to go forward. So ontology here is not referring to a discipline in the field of philosophy that studies being and how the mind conceives of the basic categories of reality. It's one aspect of it is certainly shares some elements with that. But the way that it's being used in this anthropological sense is meant to speak to ways of worlding, right? So not reality as something that is out there that we measure, but rather a way of worlding that is brought into being continuously through relationships, through multi-species relationships. There we go. This means that ways of worlding and worldings are possibly entangled, possibly in conflict, possibly situated in relation to each other in asymmetrical ways. Hence the term political ontology, because if there are different ways of worlding and they intersect and connect and come into conflict, that is political, right? It speaks to the power relationships. So to summarize, political ontology is a political sensibility committed to the concept of pluriversality. The notion that worlds are always already multiple, that ways of worlding intersect, get entangled, are potentially in conflict. So it's not about knowing and describing other worlds, but a political and ethical commitment in our own work to tell stories. Our work does tell stories about the world. It also brings those worlds into being. So the commitment here is to tell stories that bring the world into being in ways that create space for pluriversality. So why does this matter, you might say? This is very abstract, and I'm never really going to get a chance to ground it. But why does it matter to tropical forest restoration? Well, all of us here, I think, at this conference are concerned about the state of the planet that we call home, right? Climate change, deforestation, extinction. These are things that we've been talking about. Sea level rises, streams, whatever, streams that can't function. I don't have the language for that. The homogenization of life forms, right? These are all processes that are encompassed in the Anthropocene. And of course, the debates around the Anthropocene. When did it start, right? I'm not interested really in those debates, but I am partial to Lewis and Maslin's date of 1610 because it highlights the fact that the crises that we are looking at and experiencing really originated with the depredations that were set in motion by European imperialism and capitalism. And the post-colonial era did not bring an end to these processes, to imperial capitalist exploitation. Right? Rather, these processes were magnified throughout the 20th century. In Central America, the place that I know the best, right? And we saw slides, where's Zach? There's Zach, my friend Zach. We saw some slides that show processes of deforestation. They really don't get started in Central America, for instance, until the mid-20th century. And why? Well, the early to mid-20th century, right? It's because the states were working with corporations, right, to allow and facilitate corporate expansion. So we're talking about timber companies, banana plantations, the Green Revolution, which we've also heard about, cattle ranching, all in the name of progress and modernization and development, right? And in the process, indigenous and Afro-descendant ways of worlding in the Americas were deemed backward and therefore destroyable. As many indigenous scholars have argued, indigenous people have been living with the dystopian futures that many of us moderns are only now coming to terms with. In the words of Anishinaabe scholar Kyle Powys White, quote, settler colonial campaigns in the Great Lakes region, where he works, have already depleted, degraded, and irreversibly damaged the ecosystems, plants, and animals that our ancestors had local living relationships with for hundreds of years, and that are the material anchors of our contemporary customs, stories, and ceremonies. The one world mowed down those relationships that sustained multi-species world to replace them with monocrops and monocultures. We all know these stories. We tell them all the time, right? And of course, they played out in different ways in different places. What is my point? These depredations were understood and rationalized with the knowledge structures of the one world. Knowledge structures that are built on the elevation of man, and I use that word on purpose, as the rightful master of the planet's resources. The word resource is important here. Man as superior to and dominant over nature. Furthermore, the knowledges and practices that constitute the one world of imperial global capitalism disseminated the concepts that structure many of the conversations taking place in this very room. Concepts like resources, ecosystem services, forest management, forest productivity, and many more. The concept of natural resources, just to take one, calls forth a world in which the relations between humans and other beings is characterized by separation, instrumentality, domination. So let me just finish this paragraph. No, I won't finish this paragraph. Let me finish what I wanted to say. In this moment of ecological crisis, why do we think that the institutions and the knowledge structures that caused these crises are going to save us? Shouldn't we be a tiny bit suspicious about the fact that many of the institutions that once drove deforestation, for just to take one example, are now driving conservation, restoration, reforestation, and climate change mitigation projects? Have we learned from these past mistakes? You might say, yes, we've learned, so we've moved on. But have we? So I want to end by challenging each of us to consider what it would mean to relinquish our hold on the one world, which gives us so much authority, and embrace pluriversality, this openness to other ways of worlding. How would our conceptual frameworks need to change in order to work with worlds in which animals or trees are persons in certain practices and perhaps resources in other practices? What would it mean to hold those tensions and work through those tensions? What would it mean to actually engage the notion of trees or whatever as persons in other people's worlds? What if alliances were built on the basis of what Isabel Stengers calls, quote, interests in common, which are not the same interests, or an interest in nature or the environment that acknowledges neither is only such? That's it. No more time.
Do you want to try the lapel mic, or do you want to just do the podium? Hold on, Tracy. Okay. So what do you want to do about the mic? Do you want to try it? You're going to come up here? Okay. So, last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Tracy Osborne, who's an associate professor of management of complex systems at the University of California, Merced, newly appointed there. Much like the two scholars who preceded her, Dr. Osborne's work spans multiple disciplines, including political ecology, agrarian studies, political economy, and critical development studies, and Latin American studies, among others. Her research interrogates the commodification of nature through carbon markets and ecosystem services, and the ways in which environmental markets affect resource access, forest governance, and livelihoods in forest communities in Mexico and the Amazon. At the same time, Dr. Osborne truly exemplifies what it means to be an engaged scholar with a commitment to a praxis rooted in community engagement, which I realize is redundant now that I just said that, but an engaged scholar really committed to engagement. She's worked collaboratively on a project called the Climate Alliance Mapping Project, which identifies priority areas for keeping fossil fuels underground across the Americas, which was an initiative in the Public Political Ecology Lab, which she formally directed, to support engaged scholarship by communicating environmental research to a broader public. Please welcome her, Dr. Osborne.
Thank you so much, Manon, for that beautiful introduction, and also for the land acknowledgement. I too want to acknowledge the indigenous peoples of this land of Connecticut. So I'd like to share with you one of the most recent projects of engaged scholarship. So as Manon mentioned, I've done a lot of work on climate change mitigation and tropical forests using political ecology as a lens. So I've paid attention to power relations, to politics, to political economy, and ethics. And what I found in sort of my study of climate change mitigation and forests, that while in theory these projects promise to generate greenhouse gas reductions at lowest cost, and also produce many benefits for local communities, in practice we're actually seeing something very different, where it's actually failed in many ways on its own terms. So for the last year and a half, I've been doing work with an indigenous community in the Ecuadorian Amazon, and we've been looking at sort of indigenous-led kind of research around, but also the developing a project around indigenous-led climate change mitigation in forests based on indigenous knowledge. So I hope that through this talk, I'll be able to draw on some of the key concepts that both Rebecca Lave and Juanita Sundberg have shared with you earlier. Okay, so, and I think this indigenous-led approach also speaks to the themes of this conference on looking at paradigm shifts based on other ways of knowing. So we recognize that the urgency of climate change, the 2008 IPCC report recognizes that on 1.5 degrees recognizes that while the Paris Agreement asks us to hold global temperatures to 1.5, no more than 2 degrees, that 2 degrees is actually too much. It's too high. At 2 degrees, we could lose, almost all of our coral reefs. Between 2 and 3 degrees, we could lose much of the Amazon to forest dieback. And if you look at the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, if we're successful in terms of the NDCs, we're looking at a world at 3.5 degrees. So, that means massive loss of species, also hundreds of millions of lives at stake. So while the report is actually quite grim, the one ray of hope within that report recognizes that there are solutions. There are solutions, already existing solutions, that exist, while it might be politically unlikely that it is technically possible. And it includes massive investments in renewable energy, shifting from fossil fuel use to renewables, keeping fossil fuels underground, particularly coal, but also massive investments in and support of forest conservation and regeneration, reforestation. So we know that tropical forests represent an important climate change mitigation strategy. About 8 to 10% of greenhouse gas emissions are sourced from tropical forests. I work a lot in the Amazon, and the main drivers of deforestation in the Amazon are what are called the forest risk commodities. So this is soy production, cattle, palm oil, timber, but also in the Amazon, roads and infrastructure for various forms of mining, oil and gas extraction, as well as dams. And dams, while it is a form of renewable energy, when it inundates forests, it releases high levels of methane gas, which is a very powerful greenhouse gas. Tropical forests are an important strategy for greenhouse gas, for climate change mitigation, because it does something that a lot of the other mitigation strategies don't do. So while it prevents future emissions, which many of our renewable energy and other strategies do, it also allows for drawdown of existing greenhouse gases, carbon emissions in the atmosphere. And at this point, we really need systems that are going to help draw down those emissions. So the current strategy, and many of you are very aware of this, we've been talking about this, but the current strategy for mitigating climate change in tropical forests is REDD, reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation in developing countries. So it's modeled after PES, Payments for Ecosystem Services, and carbon forestry projects that really got underway in the 1990s. It's based on market logic. So essentially, these projects are attractive because the idea is that they can supply us, they can reduce these emissions at lowest cost. Most of the finance is currently coming from the public sector, and that's been discussed. About the finance for REDD has been over $20 billion. About 90% has come from the public funding and multilateral funding. So governments like Norway, the UK, Japan, Germany, the US also has been putting significant amounts of funds into REDD projects. But I think it's also important to know that much of this public funding is for what's called RED readiness. So it's preparing RED for results-based payments, which really are some things that are very much akin to carbon markets. So the voluntary market is another area of funding for RED. The compliance systems or spaces have been very reluctant to take on RED projects and forestry projects because of a number of key issues. Issues of what are called environmental integrity issues. So whether or not these projects are actually additional, the permanence issue of forests, as we've seen in the recent fires in the Amazon. I mean, even in tropical forests, those forests are not necessarily, the carbon that's stored there is not necessarily permanent. And it's not just the sort of the fires that are in many ways exacerbated by climate change, but also changes in sort of political leadership. So Bolsonaro, the current president of Brazil, has argued that the Amazon should be open to business, and some of those policies put in place have really led to massive deforestation. So in theory, as I mentioned, RED is very promising. It's argued that it's a cost-effective mitigation strategy. In the Stern review, Sir Nicholas Stern wrote, "Curbing deforestation is a highly cost-effective way of reducing greenhouse gas emissions." And sort of this concept of low-cost emissions has been prevalent. And the idea is that these projects take place in the developing world where the cost of land and labor is less expensive, so we should be moving our investments there. There's also this sort of assumption that RED will reduce deforestation and also have other ecological benefits. It'll have benefits in terms of biodiversity. Also, it will generate sustainable development for the nation state, but also it will produce local community benefits. But what we've seen, in fact, RED in practice is something very different. First of all, RED is quite costly to implement. The MRV, the monitoring, the reporting, and the verification are quite expensive processes. And there's also the environmental integrity issues that I mentioned. So the additionality, the leakage. Oh, I didn't mention leakage. So leakage is essentially if a forest is protected in one area due to a RED project, that deforestation may move to a neighboring area or to even another country due to subsistence needs or market demand. Much of the finance leads to market. So even though much of the finance is currently public, it's oriented around this sort of RED readiness, which is readiness for results-based payments. Also, these projects are managed for carbon, largely exclusively carbon, over other social and ecological values. And so when you manage for one value, for carbon, you can manage against other important ecological and social values. So you might, in many cases, we're seeing the heavy reliance on timber species or fast-growing species, and we're losing some of the biodiversity. And I think really importantly is that RED has largely failed to address the real drivers of deforestation, so these forest risk commodities. And much of this is associated with the fact that RED is expected to be a low-cost emission strategy. We were talking in Dr. Champa's in the sort of breakout group that the cost of carbon credits for RED, or the price on the carbon market, is quite low. It's between $2 and $5 per ton of carbon dioxide. And the price of carbon is so low that it's not high enough to be able to compete with some of these more lucrative land uses. It also and therefore, because it's not necessarily able to target these main drivers or the largest drivers of deforestation, it tends to target indigenous peoples and local communities. So therefore, it's also modifying or altering the indigenous land use. It also tends to be top-down development with unequal partnerships. So there's much more emphasis on, it sort of involves or includes indigenous peoples, mostly as participants as opposed to equal collaborators. Yet we know that indigenous peoples, especially when they have land title, are important protectors of their land. They're able to sort of they're important stewards of their land. And so when indigenous peoples have land title, their rates of deforestation in those areas are 3 to 4 times lower than other areas, nearby areas under state or private control. Indigenous lands are also important for storing carbon. So indigenous and local communities account for something like 300 billion metric tons of carbon, which is equal to about 33 times the global energy emissions for 2017. And this is only including the above ground carbon. But we also know that indigenous lands are often, at least in the Amazon, also are overlap with areas of fossil fuels, and indigenous peoples, to their often at great peril, are resisting fossil fuel extraction. So working closely with an indigenous community in Ecuador, I'm now at the University of California, and California has a goal to be carbon neutral by the year 2025. And so we've been developing a project to support University of California in meeting that goal. So it includes changes on campus, so procurement of renewable energy, campus energy efficiency and renewable energy on campus, use of and shift toward natural gas and biogas, but also for those emissions and for those emissions that can't be sort of, reduced on campus, there's engagement and use of carbon offsets. So UC recognizes some of the challenges of carbon offsets, many of them that I've already mentioned and that have been mentioned in this conference. And so they've been supporting faculty to develop carbon offset projects. So I've received some funding through the UC Office of the President in order to develop this project with a community in Ecuador. And the idea is to create a model for indigenous-led climate change mitigation in forests that might be a model for indigenous peoples throughout the Amazon. It sort of supports, it's based on indigenous knowledge and forest governance and forest practices, and it's also aligned with keeping fossil fuels underground. So it's an interdisciplinary team. It involves researchers from the UC system, an NGO, the Rainforest Foundation, as well as a blockchain startup that's interested in helping us to build a platform for managing ecological indicators. And also our team is deeply committed to decolonizing methodologies. So decolonizing, we draw heavily on the work of Linda Tuawai-Smith, who is a Maori scholar in New Zealand, who wrote a book of that title. And so it's, definitely guided by ethical principles that go beyond IRB. So we certainly hold to strict, sort of confidentiality and to and informed consent. But we also trouble this idea of sort of disengaged or disinterested scholarship, particularly in the public sphere. It's also very much community driven and indigenous led. We also work across, we also support the co-production of knowledge. So we're working very closely with indigenous peoples and bring together both Western and indigenous principles. So this is the project. I'm not going to necessarily mention the name of the project or the name of the indigenous group because the community is still working out a contract with the university. But I think what some important pieces of this project is that it does not limit indigenous land use practices. It supports them in keeping fossil fuels off their land. And so there are many oil blocks within Ecuador. There are about 5 oil blocks that crisscross their land, and they're basically supported for avoiding deforestation associated with oil extraction. There's also tree planting around the border of their territory that marks these forests as sacred environments. I'm just going to end with this slide. So the main differences between the project and RED are essentially that the project aims to avoid deforestation associated with oil extraction. and it allows Indigenous peoples to continue their ongoing forest practices. It also supports the Indigenous communities in developing their life plans and actually realizing their life plans. Indigenous life plans are Indigenous visions for development. That's sort of, for their own community. Also, the Indigenous technical team, they will measure carbon, biodiversity, and other indicators of ecological health. So it looks beyond just purely carbon. Also really important is that it's not a market, but it's instead a contractual agreement between the UC and the community. And this is important because it allows the community to be able to negotiate the price for the carbon for carbon and for the climate mitigation benefit. It also supports the university in achieving their carbon neutral goal, as opposed to assisting an oil company in meeting their carbon reduction targets. And also, it involves students in many aspects of the project. So there's student exchange. Also, students are likely to be involved in the verification process. And actually, this community was very excited about the possibility of student exchange. So just to end, that this is a project that we want to develop across the Amazon. The Amazon is a matrix of Indigenous territory and conservation areas, and so we hope to be able to for this project to be something that can be a model for the larger Amazon region. I'll stop there.
Great. Okay. Is this somebody's? Okay, I think I figured out what the problem was from before. So they just, yeah, you hands down. But don't put them on until I tell you to. Okay. Great. Oh my gosh. Okay. Well, I hope that you all feel as inspired as I do right now, and that you gained a lot from these theoretical, empirical, methodological insights. We have a little bit of time for a discussion, and it's going to be moderated by Samara Brock, who I'll just really briefly introduce, my friend here. Samara is pursuing her PhD here at the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. She has a master's degree in community and regional planning from UBC, and a master's in food culture from the University of Gastronomic Sciences, which is in Italy. She's worked on urban agriculture for nonprofits in Cuba and Argentina, as a food systems planner for the city of Vancouver, and more recently as a program officer for the Tides Canada Foundation, which funds NGOs working on complex conservation, climate change, and food security initiatives. Her research here builds on insights from feminist science and technology studies and critical food studies to examine how contrasting visions of the future of the global food system are formed by international experts and how these futures come to shape the worlds we live in today. So she's thinking about a lot of the same things that we heard about today. And I think if I mute myself, we might be able to do this. Let's see. Where's Beeple? Is he still here? Did he abandon me? Does that... There's supposed to be a way. Anybody who wants to jump in from the team is welcome to help me. How do I just turn this off? But that turns everything off, though. Are we sure? Because if you flip yours on...
Okay, does that work?
Now, see.
We can... Hello, hello? Oh, that seems...
Yeah, but now try it.
Hello? Hello? No? No? Oh!
Yeah, see? And that doesn't...
Not nice.
Maybe let's just speak loud. Oh,
Yeah.
that was working.
We could try that for now.
Okay, let's give it a go.
Yeah, I'm just going to stay up here for the moment.
Okay.
In case there's any...
This seems to be working. Yeah. Okay. Given time, I think my time up here is going to be short and sweet, but it was nice to sit on the stage with everybody, so that was good. I want to thank Manon for inviting me to help moderate this panel. It's a real treat in the forestry school to open up spaces to have dialogues that include critical social theory and get us thinking about decolonization and justice and inclusion issues, because it doesn't happen as much as it should here. So how we're going to do this is hopefully we'll have time. I've put together some questions. The idea was that I was going to ask a couple of them to the panel members and then turn it over to the audience to continue the conversation. And the questions I've put together sort of draw from various themes that they've all touched on to try and put them in dialogue with each other. So I'm just going to jump right into it because time. Okay, so you all write about social theory and you all brought social theory into your presentations today. I think at many institutions like this one, social theory can get a bad rap. It's seen as too abstract, too complicated, too, not tangible or useful enough to bring into day-to-day practice. And I'm just wondering what you would say to counter that. And the ways that you've seen social theory come to matter in terms of transforming environmental knowledge and practice.
All right. So, I guess the way I put this question around is say, would you try to get ecological restoration around to get ecological theory? Hopefully not, right? So we need the big. Okay, I've never thought of social theory as something that was important in isolation. But to me, what we're talking about is how we understand the world we live in. And working back and forth between high-level concepts about that and practice on the ground and letting them inform each other, to me, is a super powerful form of scholarship that allows us to think about how we generalize from the things we see in front of us. So to me, it's very important. And works it, even if it gets up.
Well, let me try. No, that doesn't work.
All right, let me try to speak loudly. From my perspective, the problems that we see in the world originate in this bifurcation. The bifurcation between natural sciences and social sciences. Like, what the heck? This goes to the core of the problems that we see today. They come out of this bifurcation because it automatically positions the human as the most important, as the center, but also as the master, as the dominant being, and instrumentalizes everything else. So we need to inform each other's. We need these forms of theoretical analysis or frameworks inform each other, which is one of the things that Rebecca has been doing in our discipline of geography, is developing this thing called critical physical geography, which brings that social theory into the very understanding and operate conduct or the practices of sciences. And it's, for us as social science, I'm a political ecologist, so obviously we need to work with understanding the natural worlds and the systems in which we're operating. But I think we need to question that vision at its very core.
And I would say that also as a political ecologist and also an engaged scholar, that theory informs really all of the work that I do. This project that I just explained on working with Indigenous peoples really is informed by some of the work around commodification of nature, some of the critiques of political ecology and geography, critiques of markets, and I think it's this kind of bifurcation that you mentioned is that we see across the sciences. Even in interdisciplinary spaces, and I actually come from an interdisciplinary department in Berkeley, and now I'm in a new interdisciplinary department, that you see the multiple ways that the disciplines, even in an interdisciplinary space, are not actually working together or communicating with one another. And I think, especially given the complexity and the enormity of these problems, we actually have to sort of think about our science in new ways and bring together. And also, I think there's also this hierarchy that was also raised, and you raised, Rebecca. There is a kind of hierarchy around the sort of what science and value of environmental issues. And I think because, given the Anthropocene, that Dr. Kuko mentioned earlier, we are in the same Anthropocene, where we recognize humans have had a significant impact on the planet. We cannot look at restoration and regeneration without really bringing together and sort of valuing the social, the social, the political, the economic. I think fields like political ecology that are interdisciplinary fields and that are theoretically based and also really respect the kind of interdisciplinary are really powerful for that.
And I would add that the communities, for instance, the indigenous communities that you mentioned, where I've done my work, they also have theories of the world and how things relate to each other. And their conceptions of relationality are incompatible with conceptualizations that are based on bifurcation. So how are we going to have a conversation when our ontologies are so completely distinct? And I didn't ground in my discussion, and I myself have tried to do that work. It will be going forward, but Mario Blasa has done work with, for instance, in the Innu communities in Labrador, in Canada, trying to look at the conversations that take place between the state officials that are trying to ban the caribou hunt by indigenous people, and the ways in which for those communities, it's not even caribou, it's equal, it's not even a caribou, it's a different thing, right? They're kind of different things. And so how are you going to negotiate between these very different things? You need to have ways of going beyond a sort of a bifurcated world in order to even enter into those conversations.
Yeah, I think that's a super important point, and one that I definitely see. I mean, obviously in places like Ecuador. I mean, and which is really, this project really is supportive of indigenous knowledge and the types of sort of the outcomes when you have projects sort of based on indigenous land use practices, that the outcomes are very different than just sort of established RED projects or conservation projects. And I think I just definitely want to also just support everything that you said, the importance of thinking outside of Western knowledge.
Okay, I'm going to take the opportunity to sneak in one more quick question, and then I'll turn it over to the audience. So, Tracy, you mentioned the Anthropocene and the urgency of the particular moment and the way it's framed through discourses like the Anthropocene in regards to climate change, species loss, etc., is often mobilized to justify quick and expedient action, and the idea that what we need is a massive disruption or transformation. And this approach can come to replicate some of the most troubling aspects of colonization, such as the idea that what we need is global experts who have a super specialized knowledge set, who can parachute into anywhere in the world and create rapid change for improvement. So how do we balance this need for urgency with the need and commitment to justice, democracy, inclusion, pluriversality, all the things that you're talking about?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. And I mean, I think we have to recognize that there is an urgency. I mean, this is sort of the ways that we can bridge and marry some of the sort of the Western and the other ways of knowing. But I think there is a certain urgency given the scale of the climate issue and sort of kind of drawing back on the IPCC report that sort of recognizes that, if we continue business as usual, we're looking at, hitting 1.5 at year 2030. So I think there is a real urgency. I think not sort of moving away from that, but also reflecting on the kind of historically, how we got to this place, sort of the fundamental drivers of the problem, and not being afraid to really, I think the elephant in the room, but that's been raised, is really this kind of growth-based capitalist economic system and the power relations that don't necessarily want to see any kind of shift away from that. And so I think recognizing the political, economic drivers of how we got to where we are, recognizing that it's a really urgent, important set of issues, ecological issues that we're faced with, but then because it's so important that we need to use all of the strategies to shift sort of these fundamental drivers, to really address the main causes of the problem, address those problems without trying to sort of skirt around the edges, which is what we've been doing, and using the same tools to solve this problem and to sort of solve by this kind of growth-based paradigm in the first place.
I would just reiterate that attention to the global institutions and what is actually being achieved. If one of the goals is to bring more and more territories into the global capitalist economic system through these mechanisms of modification, I don't really see how that's going to be a solution or bring about solutions. I don't know, from my perspective, I see students that want to work all over the world, they want to teach people adaptation. Where's the adaptation? Right here. Where is it? I don't know. We all flew here. Many of us flew here. Which, it's great to be here, but, what are we doing? Why does everybody else need to change?
Do you want anything? Okay, cool. Okay, so we have a few minutes left for audience questions. I might suggest that we take 3 questions, and then people can respond to the things that pique their interest most in those questions. So if people can raise their hands, we have mics that people can speak into. Okay, I see one there.
Hi, my name is Anna. So I would love to speak to Professor Osborne a little bit more about her project. I've been really touched by the intervention of Dr. Sundberg. You descend from missionaries, I descend from colonizers in Latin America. We both have a huge responsibility upon our shoulders because our ancestors and our classes continue to contribute to the ecocide, genocide, and epistemicide of indigenous cultures in the world, really. And I like your honesty and I appreciate it. I think that one of the main issues that I identify is that precisely we're not overcoming those bifurcations and the forest keeps on being treated as resource. And it keeps on being treated, whether it's forest as oil, forest as copper, forest as water, forest as carbon, but it keeps on being treated as a commodity that needs to somehow satisfy the market demands in the West. But among indigenous cultures, it seems to me that nature has never been a merchandise. Nature is not a resource. So I feel that we really need to shift paradigms. We really need to listen to, quote unquote, them this time. We need to learn. And the greatest environmental footprint of the world is this one in which we're standing. We can't bear another one. And right now the problem is that we're facing the new environmental footprint of the new empire that's growing in China. And that one is going to be really unsustainable. The US is already a huge burden on the planet. So I think that your question, Dr. Sundberg, is very pertinent and I appreciate it. What are we doing in the country with the largest environmental footprint? Are we going to put the burden of the future on indigenous cultures once again because their forests are our new carbon resource? Or are we going to finally, have the courage to say, we are the problem, our culture? And it is an ontological question that I feel we we all need to honestly ask. So thank you for that. And I guess it was more of a comment than a question. I do want to learn about the projects in Ecuador, though.
Here's a question.
Yeah. So I want to thank all the speakers for wonderful presentations. I think, this is for everyone, but perhaps most directly in response to Dr. Sundberg's presentation. And so as someone who's really intrigued by kind of concepts of post-positivism and working with indigenous peoples in my research, collaborating with them, really intrigued by this idea, this concept of pluriversality. But as someone whose training is in the biophysical sciences, there are things that make me uncomfortable about it as well. And so I'm wondering, what, when you run into this concept of multiple worlds, right, and being willing to accept and engage with them, sometimes those worlds are going to conflict with one another. And we've seen this in the past, we're going to see this in the future. And so I'm wondering, in doing that, what are our rights and responsibilities when those conflicts arise? Are those conflicts reconcilable? Is that even a desirable end to reconcile those? So that would be my question.
Do we want to take one more and then? Okay, answer that one. Yeah, totally. Okay, well, thank you to our panelists. That was really, really, really great. And I would love to chat with you all day on the stage, but we'll let everybody else go and,
Can
and
we
go to
just
the
thank
next
them
part.
all again, please? Round of applause.